may not be the highest quality, but this that we're standing in right now is a huge floodplain. Not the highest quality, I say, because it is largely infested with invasive species, especially reed canary grass, or stuff like this multiflora rose, which loves floodplains for some reason. Nonetheless, though, it does perform quite a function. And if it weren't for huge floodplains like this, huge undeveloped, unpaved floodplains like this, then flooding in our immediate areas would be much worse throughout the year. There would be much less nutrients to go around, or, on the other hand, there would be far too many of certain nutrients to go around, because stuff like nitrogen gets locked up in these floodplains so effectively in the alluvial soil. It's what they're made of, alluvium. It's a mix of silt and clay and decayed plant matter that all gets kind of blended up as it goes downstream and gets exchanged and mixed around with subsequent floods and discharges of water. That alluvium, flowing through streams, collects on the banks of those streams and makes ever larger and larger platforms, alluvial plains, which are very, very rich in nitrogen. And that is why so many invasive species grow here, because an overabundance of nitrogen is very attractive to some of these species, whereas many native species in our area cannot handle too much nitrogen. It causes algal blooms, causes reed canary grass to explode, and it perpetuates the cycle of ecological degradation that plants like buckthorn initiate, or sometimes are a consequence of. But these floodplains, that alluvial soil, is incredibly good at retaining water. It retains incredible amounts of water like a sponge, just soaks it up. And water continues to flow through that alluvial soil into the bodies of water in which it belongs. So it's not in your backyard or in your sub pump or anything like that. Without further ado, I present to you your greatest form, or one of your greatest forms of flood control. The floodplain. And you can see after a fresh rain, it sure is accepting a lot of water that otherwise could be in your backyard or covering your roads or anywhere else you probably don't want it to be. So what is a floodplain? Well, a floodplain is the basin around a body of moving water where the majority of flood events take place. They fill up this basin in most flood events, except for the largest of them. This basin acts as a reservoir for a lot of the pollutants and excess nutrients that these floods carry with them. It acts as a sponge, soaking up all of that water. In degraded floodplains, it also acts as a vector for a lot of invasive species, which can be transported by those flood events, picking up seeds and carrying them elsewhere. In this floodplain, we still have the dominance of cottonwoods, of elms, of some kinds of maples and box elders, and perhaps some hackberries that we'll come across. The things that you would expect and desire to have in a floodplain. Ooh, and don't forget ash trees. But we also have an overabundance of some of these species that are harmful not only to the floodplains, but to pretty much any ecosystem that they occur in, such as the Eurasian buckthorn and Amur honeysuckle. Here, on the other hand, we have a shrubby species that you would want to see in a floodplain. This is Sambucus nigra, or Sambucus candida, the black elderberry, a species that is very important to wildlife and people. So what does a floodplain do? Well, whenever there is a rain event, or, snowmelt or anything else that brings a lot of water into our ecosystems and our bodies of water, these floodplains accept most of that water through the soil. And that's not even just during flood events. Even as the stream is flowing, it flows kind of in and out of the pores of the soil, which really helps to relieve a lot of the water pressure and a lot of the excess flooding. The reason it's able to do that is because in our waterways, there is all this silt and clay that's gotten picked up in other flood events and from minor forms, hopefully minor forms of erosion elsewhere, and it all gets mixed up and blended together in the waterways as it rushes downstream, along with a bunch of decayed organic matter that's usually been reduced into little tiny particles. It mixes all together very well and forms this dense, gooey type of soil called alluvium. I love that word. An alluvium is like a sponge. It can just accept water as it flows by, and like I said, that slows down the flow of streams quite a bit. Now, in a healthy floodplain, most of the alterations to the waterways that you'll get will be horizontal, like this here. This is not the creek. The creek is over there. We'll get to it. This is a branch of the creek that goes around this island. This is an island, and isn't that nice to think about? There's somewhere in our forest preserves where humans don't really ever go, and I just love that. And here we are at the mouth. There's a good view of that alluvium. Gooey, squishy, almost like memory foam. By the way, why does the creek look like that? Well, it's because of us. It's because our ding-dong heads, these fucking steep-ass banks. It's because of shit like that development over there. When we pave the sides, put hard surfaces on the sides of these creeks, like I said, remember, this alluvium is like a sponge. Water just flows through it and back into the creek. So when you have hard surfaces, the water can't just flow through that. So it picks up speed instead. It's like you're adding momentum to it, adding weight to it. So when it does come back in contact with this alluvial stuff, it's going too fast for the alluvium to soak it up, and it just washes it away. Washing it away for it to build up somewhere very inconvenient. But that's why you have these steep banks. It wouldn't normally be like this. It would be a little more gradual, and would be subject to more horizontal change rather than, whoa, shit, vertical change. That's what I mean earlier when I said that most of the alterations happening to these waterways would be horizontal. But with human development, we get a lot of the vertical. Not saying that's entirely out of character in a native ecosystem. With enough rain, it'll happen anyway. But it doesn't just happen all the time, year-round, regardless of the flow of the stream, unless you put a bunch of hard surfaces on the sides of the water body. Honk, 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 honk. Oh! But in these floodplains is not just an exchange of water and sediments. There's also a great exchange of nutrients and pollutants. These floodplains act as a reservoir for pollution and excess nutrients, and provides an opportunity for those nutrients to be put at rest rather than getting distributed into other ecosystems that might not be able to handle those excess discharges as well. And with pollutants, it provides a place for those to be phytoremediated or cleaned out by plants and also by microbes and such before they become a threat to anything else. Now, plenty of native floodplain plants, these plants are especially adapted to the high levels of nutrients, the saturation, and is also the high levels of water that saturates the alluvium here. And that includes nitrogen, which you might know already. Nitrogen in excess, which often is the result of fertilizers and other artificially manufactured substances. Nitrogen in excess causes algal blooms, and it also causes invasive species to thrive. A lot of invasive species thrive in places that they do because they're adapted to these excess levels of nitrogen, which a lot of native species can't really accept. So what we're walking around in right here is mostly reed canary grass, which is a very aggressive, very, very aggressive invasive that settles itself in these wet environments. We also get a lot of that Eurasian buckthorn, that Rhamnus cathartica, which itself creates a nitrogen problem. So oftentimes these invasive species are a consequence of these excess nutrient overloads, and sometimes they are partially the cause of those excess nutrient overloads. Unfortunately, because of the exchange of everything that occurs in a floodplain, this also means that there is an easy exchange for invasive species and their seeds and their genes to continue to spread around. They get picked up by one flood, carried down to another place where it overflows into a different floodplain entirely, making floodplains very difficult to manage as far as ecological restoration goes. But they're worth managing because of the incredible benefit to us and other organisms. They keep our water clean. They keep pollutants out of the rest of our ecosystems, including just our towns, our strip malls, whatever have you. They keep water out of our backyards. It's one of the most effective measures for flood prevention, is just maintaining the floodplains and wetlands that are native to a certain stream, any particular stream. Just pick one. And oftentimes, what does us in, how we really just screw ourselves over, is by building in these floodplains, which people love to do. We love developing these floodplains. All that does is create a whole neighborhood to be flooded and create consequences downstream where, because the paved area can no longer accept as much floodwater, that floodwater is going to have to go somewhere, just like the sediments that get eroded downstream from paved banks. The floodplain is where it starts, but it only continues up the slopes of the floodplain and into the woodlands. From woodlands to savannas, from savannas to prairies, and at that other end of the spectrum, in the tall grass prairie, you have another form of excellent flood prevention for many different reasons than floodplains. But regardless of what you know and don't know about any of our native ecosystems, what you should know, what you should remember, is that when you look into a woodland, a forest, a floodplain, you should be able to see the forest, the woodland, the floodplain. Looking around me here, there's not a whole lot to see. There's a big old honeysuckle bush right in front of me. Big old buckthorn trees all around me. Falling, dead, decaying wood, rich in nitrogen, saturating the soil with it, with nothing to clean it up or mop it up, except plants which will create more nitrogen or return that nitrogen directly to the soil from which they drew it, allowing more invasive species to establish, causing algal blooms downstream, suffocating the aquatic ecosystems and the terrestrial ecosystems with which those aquatic ecosystems come in contact during our flood events. You hear that sound? It means we're getting close to a nice wetland. So we'll approach slowly as to not upset the residents. But a healthy floodplain complex is almost always, if not always, connected to some wetlands like this. While in the alluvium and the plants that grow within it, a lot of nutrients can be processed, a lot of pollutants can be filtered out. It's in the wetlands where the magic happens the most. Because on the base of these wetland floors, underneath the water, so much debris can collect and be locked away underneath the water and broken down over longer and longer periods of time. Floodplains and wetlands can be strategically reconnected so that these processes can better be carried out more efficiently. So if you see a floodplain, thank it. They're very underappreciated, not very often explored by your average hiker because, muddy and overgrown. But they're fascinating ecosystems from the microscopic level all the way down to the macroscopic, from things that you can't see and may never notice to things that are blaringly and dangerously obvious.